Jet Calder never fell asleep in front of anyone. Not because of any condition, but because in his world, closing your eyes around the wrong person was the fastest way to never open them again. 4 days. 4 days without more than 15 minutes of sleep at a stretch. 4 days with a headache that felt like a nail being driven through his temple. 4 days spent dealing with a traitor, 2 negotiations on the verge of collapse, and an empire cracking from the inside. But that evening, in the same VIP room where just hours earlier he'd dealt with the man who tried to sell him out, a girl walked in. She had no idea who he was. She was just there to clear the glasses and set up drinks for the next round of guests. And Jet Calder, the man no one in New York's underworld dared turn their back on, fell asleep, right there in his chair, less than 2 steps away from her. If this story touched you, hit like and share it so more people can hear it. And if you want to follow the next stories, subscribe to our channel. We'll be back soon with a new one. A few hours earlier, the VIP room on the 2nd floor of the Regency restaurant still hung heavy with the smell of cigarettes and tension. 7 men sat around the long table, but only one man truly held power in that room. Jet Calder sat at the head of the table, his back straight, both hands placed in front of him. He didn't need to sit higher than anyone else to make the entire room lower its head. Across from him sat Danny Ferris, the man who had overseen the Calder family's entire eastern transport route for 6 years. 6 years of loyalty, or at least it had looked that way, until Reed placed a recording on Jet's desk 3 days earlier. In that recording, Danny's voice came through with painful clarity, reading out every number, every name, every route to Salazar, the man who led the opposing faction in the West. Danny sat there, sweat running down his temple. He was waiting for Jet to speak. The whole room was waiting for Jet to speak, but Jet said nothing. He only looked at Danny, silent. The kind of silence that made a man want to confess everything just to make it stop. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Danny's whole body began to tremble slightly. 4 minutes. He couldn't take it anymore. Jet, I can explain. His voice was hoarse, trying to hold steady, but breaking on the last sound. Jet still didn't move. His eyes weren't angry, weren't cold, just simply empty, as though Danny had stopped existing to him 3 days ago. The moment that recording landed on his desk, Salazar promised he wouldn't touch my family, Danny went on, his voice faster now, more desperate. He said if I didn't cooperate, my wife, my children, I'm giving you 20 seconds. Jet cut him off. His voice wasn't louder than a whisper, but it sliced through the room like a knife through paper. Everyone froze. Danny opened his mouth, then closed it again. 20 seconds to tell me one thing I don't already know? Jet continued. Not a reason, not an apology. One piece of information, anything of value. Danny swallowed. His eyes darted around the room as though searching for help, but no one looked at him. No one dared. Salazar has someone inside the Newark port, Danny said quickly. Not one of your men. Customs. Name's Morrison. He controls Gate 4. Jet looked at Danny for 3 more seconds. Then he gave Reed a slight nod. Reed stood, walked to Danny's side, and placed a hand on his shoulder. Not heavy, not rough, just a hand on a shoulder. But Danny rose at once, as though that hand were a sentence passed down. Reed led him out of the room. The door closed. No one asked where Danny was going. Jet turned back to the 5 men who remained. The headache was gnawing behind his eyes, spreading to his temples, then running down the back of his neck. 4 days without real sleep had begun demanding its price, but his face showed nothing. He had never allowed his body to betray him in front of his men. The Eastern route needs a new man within 48 hours, Jet said. Loy, you're in charge temporarily. The man being addressed nodded. Newark Port. Morrison at Gate 4. I need to know how much Salazar is feeding him, before Friday. Another man nodded. The 2 negotiations with the Bronx side are still hanging. Fletcher wants another 15%. Tell him I agree to 10. No negotiation. If he doesn't take it, I'll find someone else. Neat, fast. Each problem was handled as though he were reading a shopping list, not holding an empire back from collapse. But Reed, who had just returned after taking Danny away, noticed what no one else noticed. Jet's left hand rested on the table, his thumb pressing into his temple. A small movement, almost unconscious. He was in pain. Terrible pain. The meeting ended within 15 minutes. One by one, the men left, their footsteps quick and light, as though they were afraid of creating any unnecessary sound. Reed was the last. He paused at the door and looked back. Jet was still sitting there. "Do you need anything?" Reed asked. 15 minutes of quiet, Jet replied. Reed nodded and closed the door behind him. The room sank into silence. For the first time in 4 days, no one was talking, asking, or waiting for him to make a decision. Jet leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes. The headache still throbbed, but at least now he didn't have to keep his face in place anymore. He only needed 15 minutes. Just 15 minutes of not being Jet Calder. Then the VIP room door opened, and a girl stepped inside. When Reed pushed open the VIP room door 15 minutes later, he expected to find Jet still sitting with his eyes closed, or reviewing documents. Instead, Jet sat upright, his back straight, both hands placed on the table, his eyes fixed on the door as if he were waiting for someone to explain something he didn't understand. On the table, beside the stack of files, sat a half-finished pale yellow cocktail. Reed had never seen that glass there before. "Who came into this room after you left?" Jet asked. His voice was calm, but Reed caught something different in his boss's eyes. Not anger, not exhaustion, confusion. And Reed could count on one hand the number of times he had seen Jet Calder confused in 11 years at his side. "The service staff," Reed said. "The restaurant sent someone up to restock drinks for the next sitting. I checked the roster before I left. Only one person was assigned to the VIP room tonight. A replacement staff member. She wasn't on the regular list." Jet looked at him. "Name?" "Not yet. I'll check with the restaurant manager." "Do it now." Reed nodded, but didn't turn away immediately. He looked at the cocktail, then back at Jet. "What happened?" Jet stayed silent for a moment. Reed knew his boss was weighing how much to say, how much to keep back. It was the habit of a man who had spent his life in a world where information was a weapon. At last Jet spoke, his voice low and slow, as if confirming it to himself. "I fell asleep." Reed blinked. "She came into the room. My eyes were closed. She said something about the ingredients in the drink. Then I lost consciousness. Completely." He paused. "When I woke up, she was gone. I don't know how long I was out. I don't know how long she stayed in the room. I don't know if she took anything, photographed anything, or called anyone." Reed felt a chill run down his back, not because he feared Jet, but because he understood what Jet was saying. This room, 2 hours earlier, had been where Danny Ferris sat. On this table there had been files containing names, addresses, and account numbers for every Eastern route. If Danny had still been in the room when Jet lost consciousness, if instead of that girl it had been one of Salazar's people who walked in, Reed didn't finish the thought in his head. He didn't need to. They both understood. "The girl who just left," Jet said. "Find out everything about her. Everything. I want to know who she is, where she lives, who she works for, who she's connected to. Before tomorrow morning." Reed nodded again, faster this time, already pulling out his phone as he turned away. Jet remained alone. He looked at the cocktail on the table, picked it up, brought it to his nose. A light herbal scent. Lavender, chamomile, maybe mint. Nothing unusual. No strange odor, no suspicious bitterness. He took a sip, then another. Nothing. Just a normal hand-mixed cocktail. Even a good one. He set the glass down. So it wasn't the drink. If it wasn't the drink, then it was her. That girl had stood in this room, spoken to him, and somehow his body had decided she wasn't a threat. For 4 days he hadn't been able to sleep because his mind refused to shut down under any circumstance. For 4 days his body had fought exhaustion with adrenaline and sheer will, but she walked in, and all of that collapsed. No alarm bell, no instinct telling him to open his eyes, stay alert, stay guarded. She walked in, and he let go. That was what unsettled Jet more than Danny Ferris, more than Salazar, more than the 2 negotiations still hanging, Danny's betrayal. Jet knew how to handle Salazar's war. Jet knew how to fight, but his body surrendering on its own to a stranger he hadn't even properly seen, that was something he didn't know what to do with. Jet stood. The headache was still there, but now it had been pushed to second place. He walked out of the VIP room, down the corridor toward the elevator. His steps were even, his back straight, his face expressionless. Anyone who saw him at that moment would think Jet Calder was completely normal, but in his mind, the same question repeated itself all the way back to the penthouse. Who was she? And why? When she was near him, Did the survival instinct that had kept him awake for 11 years decide that he could close his eyes? Reed called back at 4 o'clock in the morning. Jet hadn't slept. Alara Quinn, 27 years old. No family. Grew up through multiple foster homes. No place kept her for long. On her own since 18. Currently working as a bartender at the Amber, a cocktail bar in Lower Manhattan. The bar supplies drinks to the Regency restaurant under a service contract. Clean background. No criminal record. No major debts. No connection to any organization we know. Reed paused. She doesn't even have a parking ticket. Jet sat in the study of his penthouse, the phone pressed to his ear, his fingers tapping lightly against the desktop. Who sent her to the VIP room last night? The restaurant manager. The regular VIP server got sick, and Miss Quinn covered the shift at the last minute. She'd never served the VIP floor before. Did anyone ask for her to cover the shift? Someone outside the restaurant? No, I checked. It really was a coincidence. Jet said nothing. In his world, coincidence was the word people used when they hadn't found the chain yet, but Reed had worked with him long enough to know when to say more and when to stay quiet. This time he said more. Jet, I dug deep. She's clean. She isn't anyone's pawn. Everyone looks clean until they don't, Jet answered. Danny Ferris looked clean for 6 years too. Reed went silent because there was nothing to argue against. The next evening, Jet went to the Amber himself. He didn't tell Reed in advance. He didn't bring anyone with him. He only changed into a less formal suit than usual and walked into the bar like an ordinary customer. The place was smaller than he had expected. The main bar in front was crowded, the music just loud enough to hear, the light warm. Jet didn't sit there. He went straight toward the back, where a small lounge area sat apart from the rest. Only 4 or 5 tables, fewer customers, quieter. He chose the innermost corner, his back to the wall, his eyes facing the door. Habit. A server came over and asked what he wanted. Not her. He ordered an old-fashioned and waited. He didn't wait long. Alara Quinn stepped out from behind the bar, a tray in her hand, moving around the lounge to serve. She stopped at his table because the first server had turned toward another section. Sorry, your old-fashioned is being made. It'll be about 2 minutes, she said. Her voice was light, quick, the voice of someone used to speaking to strangers without having to think about it. She didn't recognize him. That wasn't surprising. Last night in the VIP room, the lights had been dim. He had been sitting in the corner, and she had only come in to clear glasses and set down drinks. She had probably seen nothing more than a shape in a chair. Jet nodded. She turned away, served the next table, then returned with his cocktail. As she set the glass down, she said, as though this was something she told every customer, "Our old-fashioned uses a little fresh orange peel and honey instead of white sugar. If you don't like it sweet, next time I'll have them go lighter on the honey." Jet looked at her. She was speaking to him the way she would speak to anyone. No fear, no calculation, no look in her eyes that suggested she was trying to read him. She was simply introducing the drink. And she was talking about honey. He almost found that funny. Almost. She went to serve another table. Jet picked up the glass, but didn't drink. He sat there, watching her move between the tables, looking for any sign. Whether the way she looked around meant she was checking for someone, whether there was anything unusual in the way she held her phone, whether the way she spoke to customers was meant to draw out information. Nothing. She mixed drinks, smiled at regulars, explained the difference between 2 kinds of mint to a middle-aged man ordering a mojito. She was just a 27-year-old woman doing her job. Then Jet realized something else. The headache that had clung to him for 4 days was easing, not gone, but softer. His shoulders, which he hadn't realized had been locked tight, were lowering. His breathing was slowing. He hadn't taken a single sip. The old-fashioned still sat untouched on the table. It wasn't the drink. He had known that since last night. But sitting there, watching her pass back and forth only a few steps away from him, he confirmed the thing he had hoped he was wrong about. It was her. Something about her. The faint scent of herbs drifting past when she walked by. Her light and even voice as she explained the mint. Or maybe simply her presence itself made every warning system inside him power down. And that didn't reassure him. It made him want to stand up and leave immediately. Because if she could make him lower his guard without even trying, then anyone who knew it could use her to get close to him. Alara Quinn wasn't dangerous, but her existence within the radius of his life was Jet placed money on the table, stood, and left the bar before she could return to him. Reed was waiting in the car. He looked at Jet through the rearview mirror but didn't ask. Jet looked out through the window. My reaction around her is what's dangerous. Reed still didn't ask, but he drove more slowly than usual, as though giving Jet time to think. Jet didn't need time. He had already decided. He needed to control this variable. And the only way to control a variable was to bring it within range, where he could see it. 3 days after the night Jet went to the Amber, Reed received a call from the family lawyer. Jet wanted to buy the bar. Reed checked the list of properties being expanded in Lower Manhattan. The Amber sat on a street where the Calder family already owned 3 adjoining commercial spaces. From a business standpoint, buying this bar to take over the whole row made perfect sense. On paper, it was a real estate investment decision. Reed signed the papers without asking, but in 11 years at Jet's side, Reed had never once seen his boss take an interest in a small bar that sold herbal cocktails to passing customers. Not once. The owner was an older woman named Thorne. She didn't want to sell. Jet didn't pressure her in the way people would usually imagine. He offered a number 30% higher than the true value, along with the condition that Mrs. Thorne would stay on as manager with full authority to run the place. She looked at the number, looked at the contract, looked at Reed standing behind it, and then signed. She wasn't stupid. She knew what kind of person made an offer people didn't refuse, but she also knew when an agreement was better than fighting against it. The bar changed hands within 1 week. No one at the bar knew, including Alara, and Jet began coming in. Every night, the same corner in the lounge area at the back. The same old-fashioned that he hardly ever drank. He arrived around 9 o'clock, stayed until 10, sometimes 11, then left. He didn't talk to anyone. He didn't look at his phone. Sometimes he opened his laptop and worked. Sometimes he only sat still with his eyes closed. The first week, Alara didn't notice. Customers coming to a bar alone weren't unusual. The second week, she began to realize the guest in the inner corner always ordered the same drink, always sat in the same place, always came at the same hour, and always left without saying a single word beyond thank you when she set the glass down. By the third week, she started getting curious. You don't like old fashions very much, do you? She asked one evening as she cleared away a glass that was still almost full. Jet looked up. Why do you think that? Because you order one every night, but you've never finished it. Jet looked at her for a moment. This was the first time she had spoken to him on her own beyond taking his order. I like sitting here, he said. He offered no further explanation. She didn't ask for one, but from that night on, she began lowering the amount of liquor in his glass and adding a little fresh lemon. He didn't comment, but she noticed he drank more than before. One Friday night, the bar was busier than usual. The back lounge had a few more groups of customers, too. A group of 4 drunken men sat at the middle table and began making noise. At first, it was only loud talking, then loud laughter, then pounding on the table. One of them ordered more alcohol. Alara brought it over. The man took the glass and looked her up and down in a way that made her want to step back. Hey, pretty girl. Sit down and have a drink with us, he said. Alara shook her head, forced a smile, and stepped back. He reached out and grabbed her wrist. Not hard, but enough to startle her and make the tray in her hand tilt. A glass fell to the floor and shattered. The entire lounge turned to look. Alara pulled her hand back and retreated toward the bar. Her hand was shaking as she pulled out her phone, about to call security. Then she heard a voice from the innermost corner. Travis. 1 word. Just 1 word. Jet's voice wasn't louder than normal. If anything, it might have been softer. But it cut through the noise of the whole lounge as if someone had just turned off the music. The drunk man turned around, and his face changed color. He recognized Jet, or he recognized what Jet's face represented. Alara didn't know which, but she saw a man drunk enough to have just touched a strange woman suddenly sober up in half a second. Calder, I didn't know you, he began. Take your men out of here, Jet said, still sitting, still not lifting himself from the chair. And call Henderson. Tell him his son is making trouble in my bar. The men stood at once. The other 3 stood with him. No one said another word. They left the bar within 30 seconds. Alara stood beside the bar, still holding the phone she hadn't had time to use. She looked at Jet. He had already turned back to his laptop as though nothing had happened. But she had just seen something she couldn't forget. The 4 men who had left hadn't gone because they were afraid of being thrown out. They had left because they were afraid of the man sitting in the corner. The man who ordered an old-fashioned every night and had never finished one. She bent down to pick up the broken glass from the floor, her hand still trembling slightly. When she stood again, she looked toward the lounge corner one more time. Jet was still looking at his laptop, but the old-fashioned in front of him had been finished. For the first time, the first message came on a Tuesday morning. Alara had just come out of the subway station and was walking toward the bar when her phone vibrated. An unknown number. She opened it, and her heart tightened. It was a photograph of her from behind, walking down the very street she took every day. Beneath it was one line of text. "Be careful on your way to work." She stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, looked around. People were passing by as usual. No one was looking at her. No one seemed to be taking pictures. She deleted the message, shoved her phone into her bag, and kept walking. Her hand gripped the strap of her bag tighter than usual. The second message came the next day. This time, it was a photo of her standing behind the bar, taken through the bar's front window. Nice place. Too bad the new owner doesn't know how to keep his employees safe. The third message came the following day. No photo, just 4 words. "I know your shifts." Alara didn't tell anyone. Not because she was brave, but because she didn't know who to tell. Mrs. Thorne was busy managing the bar. Her coworkers were just coworkers. She had no family to call. Her whole life, she had handled everything on her own, and this was only one more thing she had to handle alone. She began changing her route every day. In the morning, she took a different train line. At night, she went home by a different street. She looked over her shoulder more often. She stopped wearing headphones when she walked. She left the bar when someone else was heading in the same direction instead of leaving alone. Jet noticed. Not because she said anything. She didn't say a word, but he sat in the corner of the lounge every night. And he watched her more than he wanted to admit. He saw her walk faster before entering the bar. Saw her glance toward the front window more often. Saw her clutch her phone tightly in her hand, instead of leaving it on the counter the way she usually did. And he saw her eyes, when she thought no one was looking, holding something he recognized at once, because he had lived with it all his life. Fear, trying to hide itself. That night, in the car, Jet called Reed. "Someone's watching Miss Quinn." "How do you know?" "She's changed her route to work 3 days in a row. She looks over her shoulder every time someone walks too close. Find out who's doing this." Reed took less than 2 days. The person sending the messages was Martin Voss, the former owner of the Amber. He couldn't swallow the fact that the bar had been bought at a price he considered forced, even though on paper it had been a fair agreement. He didn't dare touch Jet or anyone connected to the Calder family, but he was cowardly enough to take his anger out on a 27-year-old bartender who lived alone. Reed handled it. Jet didn't ask how. 2 days after Reed reported back, the messages stopped completely. Alara breathed in relief, though she didn't understand why. But the calm didn't last. A week later, Alara came to the bar in the morning and saw that the front window had been smashed. Shards of glass were scattered across the sidewalk. Mrs. Thorne stood inside, sweeping, her face calm as if this were only a small inconvenience. But when Alara looked closely, Mrs. Thorne's hands were shaking too. The police came to make a report and said it might have been random vandalism. Alara knew it wasn't. That evening, Jet didn't come to the bar. Instead, when Alara was getting ready to end her shift, Reed walked in. He stood at the counter, polite, his voice low. "Miss Quinn, my boss would like to offer you a job. Private bartender. Home service. 5 times your current salary." Alara looked at him. "I'm not selling myself." "This is a job, Miss Quinn. Mixing drinks. Nothing more. Mixing drinks inside the home of a man whose last name I don't even know. In a home where I don't know the address. For an unusually high salary no one will explain." She shook her head. "I'm not stupid enough not to recognize when something sounds too good to be true." Reed nodded, didn't press, and left. A week passed. Alara still went to work, still looked over her shoulder. The broken window was replaced, but she still saw it every time she passed, like an unhealed scar on the face of the bar. Then Reed came back. This time, he brought a printed contract. 2 pages, clear. Private bartender, serving at the penthouse. Fixed salary paid monthly. A private room, with her own lock, and a key she would keep. The right to terminate the contract at any time, with 24 hours notice. No binding clause, no hidden terms. Reed placed the contract on the counter. My boss said you have the right to refuse, but he also said you should know that the person who sent those messages to you has been dealt with. The person who broke the glass hasn't, and he isn't sure the next time will only be glass. Ilara looked at the contract, then at the newly replaced window, where the sealant at the edges still hadn't dried. She thought of the small rented room where she slept every night, listening to footsteps in the hallway and wondering which ones belonged to neighbors and which ones didn't. She thought of her bank account, slowly running dry, of the reality that she had no one to call if something happened at 2 o'clock in the morning. She picked up the pen and signed. Jet Calder's penthouse sat on the top floor of a building in Tribeca. Ilara walked in on her first day with a small suitcase, and the feeling that she had just signed a contract to step into a world where she didn't belong. Reed gave her a brief tour. Her room was at the end of the hallway, across from Jet's. A private lock, a key she kept, exactly as the contract had promised. The room was clean, the bed larger than any bed she had ever slept in, the window looking out over the Manhattan skyline. The minibar sat in the main living room, between the open kitchen area and Jet's desk. Reed showed her the ingredient cabinet that had already been prepared, filled with every kind of liquor, herb, and fruit. She didn't ask who had known exactly which ingredients she usually used. Mixed drinks every night from 8 o'clock. Mornings are yours. If you need anything, call me. Reed placed his business card on the counter and left, and just like that, her new life began. Every night, Ilara stood behind the minibar and made cocktails. Jet sat about 4 meters away at his desk, reading documents or speaking on the phone in a low voice whose words she couldn't quite hear. He didn't look at her, didn't speak to her, didn't nod when she placed the glass beside his hand. He lifted the glass, drank, set it down, and kept working, as if the cocktail had appeared on its own, as if she wasn't there. In the first days, Ilara felt like a piece of furniture, a drink-making machine with legs that knew how to walk. She finished mixing, cleaned the counter, then returned to her room, closed the door, locked it, lay on a bed too large for one person, and stared at the ceiling. She wondered what she was doing here. She wondered what he had really hired her for. She wondered how long it would be before this contract ended, and she had to find somewhere new again, because it always ended. Always. But then, on the morning of the 4th day, Ilara stepped out of her room and found a cup of coffee on the kitchen counter. Still hot, made exactly the way she liked it. Black, no sugar, a little cinnamon. She looked around. The penthouse was silent. Jet had left early. There was no one else. No note. No message. Just a cup of coffee, already made, placed exactly where she would stand every morning. She drank it. She didn't ask who had made it. The next morning, the coffee was there again. And the morning after that, she still didn't ask, because she knew that if she asked, it might stop, and she didn't want it to stop. The evening work slowly became a familiar rhythm. 8 o'clock, she came out to the bar, prepared the ingredients, mixed the first glass, set it beside Jet's hand. He lifted it, drank, said nothing. She made the second around 9:30. A third if he was still working after 10 o'clock. Between drinks, she wiped the counter, arranged the ingredients, or stood quietly looking out the window. He worked. She waited. No one said anything. Until the 12th night, Ilara changed the recipe. Not because she was trying to get his attention. She had simply run out of chamomile, so she replaced it with calendula and added a little fresh ginger instead of mint. A different taste, a different scent. She set the glass beside Jet's hand as usual. He lifted it, took a sip, then stopped. Why is it different today? Ilara stood beside the counter, a cloth in her hand, and froze. He looked up. For the first time in 12 days, he looked straight at her while speaking. I ran out of chamomile, she said, so I used calendula instead, and added ginger, like panat. Jet looked at the glass, then at her. I liked the old version better. Then he turned back to his work. 4 words. I liked the old version better. It was the longest sentence he had said to her since she moved in, and it told her something 12 days of silence had not. He drank every glass she made. He remembered the taste of each one. He noticed at once when she changed a single ingredient. For 12 days, she had thought she was invisible. But he had seen everything. That night, after Ilara finished cleaning the bar and walked back to her room, she passed Jet's door. It was closed. The light inside was still on. She stopped. Without knowing why, she said, just loud enough to be heard, "Good night." Silence. She kept walking. The next night, she said it again. This time, from behind the closed door, came the faintest acknowledgement. Not a word, just a small sound in his throat, the kind of HM people make when they hear something but don't know how to answer. Alara smiled. She didn't know why. That HM meant nothing at all. But in a vast penthouse where she lived with a man who almost never spoke to her, that HM was the closest thing to a good night she had received in a very long time. That night began normally. Alara stood behind the minibar, slicing orange peel for the last batch of cocktails of the day. Jet sat at his desk, reading something on his laptop. The familiar silence, then the penthouse doorbell rang. Jet looked at his phone, stood, and walked toward the door. Reed entered first, followed by a man Alara had never seen before. Middle-aged, gray suit, hair combed back. He looked like an ordinary businessman, but his eyes kept jumping, never staying on one place for more than 2 seconds. Reed led the two men into Jet's study, just across the hallway. The door didn't close all the way, not because of carelessness. Jet was never careless. The door was left slightly open because Reed stood right in the passageway, his shoulder blocking it, and in that position, it couldn't fully shut. Alara kept cutting the orange. She wasn't trying to listen, but the penthouse was quiet, and the voices from the next room carried clearly. 48 hours. Jet's voice, calm, even as though he were reading the weather. "Jet, please understand, I don't have enough time to." The other man's voice shook at the end of the sentence. "I'm not asking whether you have enough time or not. I'm telling you that you have 48 hours. But if I return it, Salazar will know That's your problem." Silence. Alara heard the man's heavy breathing. Then his voice came again, lower, almost begging. "Jet, I have a family. I have young children. Please give me more time. I'll find a way." 48 hours. Jet repeated it in the same voice, the same rhythm, without changing a single word, as though the man hadn't spoken at all. As though the begging, the family, the young children, had failed to register even one reaction in the man sitting across from him. Alara's hand stopped. The knife rested on the cutting board, half an orange still unfinished. Her heart began beating faster. She had heard Jet speak on the phone many times, his voice low, the content unclear. But this was the first time she had heard him speak directly to someone who was afraid of him. And what sent a chill down her spine wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. Not angry, not loud, not threatening, just truth, spoken in the voice of a man who knew for certain that everything he said would happen exactly as stated. The chair scraped, footsteps followed. Reed led the man out. He passed through the living room with his eyes down, not looking at Alara, not looking at anyone. The penthouse door closed. Silence returned. Alara stood behind the bar, both hands gripping the edge of the counter, trying to make herself look normal. Then Jet stepped out of the study. He stopped in the middle of the living room. He looked at her. She looked at him. And across the 4 meters between the bar and where he stood, no one said anything for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. Jet knew she had heard. She knew he knew. "You can leave if you want," he said. His voice wasn't cold. It wasn't warm. It was only truth, exactly like the way he had spoken to the other man. "I don't keep anyone." Then he turned, walked into his room, and closed the door. Alara stood behind the bar for another 10 minutes without mixing anything, cleaning anything, doing anything. Then she returned to her room. She closed the door, and for the first time since moving into the penthouse, she turned the lock. The small click of the lock sounded tiny in the silent apartment, but to her it was as loud as a confession. She was afraid of him. She lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart still racing. She thought about that voice. 48 hours. Not angry, not loud, just a sentence handed down in the most ordinary voice in the world. She closed her eyes. She couldn't sleep. 1 hour passed. Maybe 2. The penthouse was so quiet she could hear the air conditioner running. Then she heard another sound, from the room across the hallway. At first, she thought it was the wind, but no, it was breathing, fast, urgent, like someone running inside a dream. Then the sound of someone turning over, not the normal kind of turning in sleep. Violent. The bed creaked. Then came a sound that made her sit straight up. A groan. Low. Choked. Like someone trying to scream but unable to make a sound. Alara sat on the bed, both hands gripping the blanket. The man on the other side of the wall, the man she had been so afraid of 3 hours earlier that she had locked her door, was having a nightmare. And the sound coming from him didn't sound like a man who controlled everything. It sounded like a man drowning with no one there to pull him out. Alara put her feet on the floor, walked to the door, unlocked her room, the click sounding again, but this time carrying the opposite meaning. She crossed the hallway, stopped in front of Jet's door. Her hand settled on the handle. Inside, the rapid breathing continued. She had locked her door because she was afraid of him, and now she was standing here, about to open his door, because she couldn't bear the sound of him hurting. She didn't understand herself, but she turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was dark, the curtains were drawn, but the city lights still slipped through enough for Alara to see Jet's shape on the bed. He lay on his side, his whole body rigid. His left hand gripped the bedsheet so tightly that his fingers had turned white. His right hand pressed into the mattress as if he were trying to keep himself from falling into some place only he could see. His breathing was fast and shallow, broken by choked groans caught in his throat. The kind of sound a person makes when the mouth wants to scream but the body won't allow it. Alara stood in the doorway, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She didn't know what she was supposed to do. She didn't know whether she had any right to be here. She only knew that the sound coming from the man on the bed was something she couldn't keep listening to without doing something. She walked to the side of the bed, slowly, as softly as she could. Then she sat on the edge of the mattress and placed her hand over the one gripping the sheet. Her fingers touched his. He was cold, absurdly cold for a heated room. She held his hand, gently, just enough to let him know someone was there. And everything happened in less than 2 seconds. Jet opened his eyes. His hand closed around her wrist, fast and certain as an iron trap. He held her at arm's length, his whole body snapping upright by instinct. His eyes wide open, but seeing nothing yet. His eyes were wild, not recognizing the room, not recognizing her, seeing only danger. Alara didn't have time to pull her hand back. She didn't scream either. Partly because fear had frozen her. Partly because some instinct told her that if she screamed, he would react harder. She sat still. Her wrist hurt, but she didn't yank it away. She looked straight into his eyes and waited. 1 second. 2 seconds. Jet's eyes changed. The wildness receded, giving way to awareness, and then awareness gave way to horror when he saw his own hand locked around her wrist. He let go as if he had touched fire, drew back. His back hit the headboard. His hands closed, opened, closed, opened. As if he were trying to control something his body still wouldn't let him control. His hands were shaking. Alara looked down at her wrist. A little red. It would bruise, not broken. She looked up. Jet was staring at her wrist, his face paler than it had been in the dream. "I'm sorry." His voice was thick and hoarse, as though unused for hours. I know," Alara said. Her voice shook too, but she held it steady enough. "I know you didn't mean to." Silence. Jet sat against the headboard, his eyes lowered to the shaking hands in his lap. He didn't tell her to leave. He didn't tell her to stay either. He only sat there, breathing, trying to recover the rhythm the nightmare had stolen from him. Alara sat still beside the bed. Then she asked, softly, without pushing, "What did you dream about?" Jet didn't look at her, didn't answer. His jaw tightened. She didn't ask a second time. Instead, she looked around the room and saw an armchair in the corner near the window. She stood, pulled the chair closer to the bed, sat down, and tucked her legs up. "I'll sit here for a while," she said, not asking permission, not explaining, only saying what she was going to do. Jet looked at her. In the darkness, she couldn't read the expression on his face. But he didn't tell her to get out. He didn't say anything at all. He lay down again, turned his back to her. The first minute, his breathing was still shallow and quick. The second minute, it slowed a little. By the 5th minute, his shoulders lowered. By the 10th minute, the hand gripping the sheet gradually loosened. By the 20th minute, he was asleep. Alara sat in the chair, both arms wrapped around her knees, watching his back rise and fall with his steady breathing. He slept more deeply than she had ever seen. No turning, no groaning, no fists in the sheets, just breathing. She stayed there until her eyes grew heavy, and then she fell asleep in the chair too, her knees still drawn to her chest, her chin resting on her arm. When Alara woke, morning had come. She was curled in the armchair, her neck stiff, her back aching. The bed was empty. Jet was already up and gone. She stood, rubbed her neck, and went outside. The coffee was on the counter, still hot. No note, no message. No one mentioned last night. All that day, Alara didn't see Jet. She mixed drinks that evening as usual. He sat working as usual. No one spoke about her wrist, now turning a faint purple beneath the long sleeve she used to hide it. No one spoke about the nightmare. No one spoke about the armchair. When she finished cleaning the bar and walked back to her room, she passed Jet's door as she did every night. "Good night," she said. Silence. She kept walking. Then she stopped, because she realized Jet's door wasn't locked. It wasn't fully closed. It was open, just a few centimeters. Alara looked at the narrow gap. She didn't step inside. Not tonight, but she understood what he was saying through that cracked door. And she went back to her room. This time, she didn't turn the lock. It became a habit no one named. Every night, after cleaning the bar, Alara passed Jet's room, said good night, then gently pushed the door that had been left ajar. She stepped inside, sat in the armchair in the corner, tucked her legs up, and stayed there. No one invited her, no one thanked her, no one discussed it. She simply came in, sat down, and Jet slept. The first night after the night she had held his hand, Jet lay with his back to her and said nothing. It took 15 minutes for him to fall asleep. The second night, 10 minutes. The third night, he lay down, closed his eyes, and his breathing slowed almost at once, as though his body had begun to understand that the soft footsteps on the floor and the quiet creak of the chair when she sat down meant he was allowed to rest. Alara didn't understand the mechanism. She didn't know why her presence worked. She only knew that when she was here, he slept. And when he slept, his face changed. The jaw that stayed tight all day loosened. The crease between his brows disappeared. He looked younger, like an ordinary 33-year-old man, instead of a man carrying the weight of an entire empire on his shoulders. She never touched him, and he never turned his face toward her when he slept. That was the boundary. No one drew it, but they both kept it. Around the fifth night, Jet began to speak, not telling stories, not making conversation, just small fragments, falling out in the dark, into the silence before sleep took him. "I don't remember the last time I slept more than 4 hours." She didn't answer, didn't ask. She only sat still, and he either went on or didn't. Most of the time, he didn't. The seventh night. "Every time I close my eyes, I see the same thing. Walls closing in, the room shrinking. Then there's no air." Alara listened, both arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes on the ceiling. She didn't say, "I'm sorry for you," or, "I understand." She was simply there, and maybe that was why he kept speaking. The ninth night. "Some nights I wake up and don't know where I am. It takes a few seconds to realize this is my room. Those few seconds are the worst." He didn't explain in detail, didn't say any names, didn't reach farther into the past than the nightmares. But with every small fragment he let fall, Alara pieced together a picture she hadn't seen whole, but whose shape she could already feel. He wasn't afraid of sleeping because of vigilance. He was afraid of sleeping because every time he closed his eyes, something on the other side was waiting for him, and that thing hurt more than sleeplessness. She didn't ask what it was. Not yet. On the 14th night, Jet didn't come home. Reed called Alara at 9 o'clock in the evening, his voice brief. "Boss has outside business. Stay in the penthouse. Don't go out. There's someone stationed in the lobby." Then he hung up. Alara made the drinks, then cleaned up even though no one drank them. Habit. She washed the tools, wiped the bar, arranged the ingredients for tomorrow, finished everything. The penthouse was silent. She stood in the middle of the living room, and for the first time realized how large the apartment was when there was only one person in it. She wasn't sleepy. She walked around, not looking for anything, just walking because she didn't know what else to do. She passed Jet's room. The door was ajar as it was every night. She looked in. The bed was empty. The room was so orderly it felt lifeless. The sheets were perfectly straight. There was nothing on the nightstand. No book, no clock, no photograph. The table by the window held nothing but a lamp. The closet probably had clothes inside, but from the outside, nothing said who the owner was. Not one family photograph, not one personal object, not one thing that showed someone truly lived here. Alara stood in the doorway of Jet's room and felt something tighten in her chest. She knew this feeling. She had lived with it all her life. This wasn't anyone's home. This was where a person slept when he had nowhere else to go. Like her rented room. Like every temporary bedroom in every foster home she had ever passed through. Clean, neat, and with no trace of herself anywhere. Because leaving traces meant believing she would stay, and both she and he had learned not to believe that. She closed his door, went back to her room, lay down, couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Jet Calder, the most powerful man she had ever met, living in a penthouse worth millions of dollars that looked as though no one had moved in. The next morning, Alara woke early. Jet hadn't come back. She sat at the kitchen counter drinking coffee, this time made by herself, because there was no one to make it for her. 8 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. At 11 o'clock, the penthouse door opened. Jet stepped inside, his suit jacket wrinkled, the shadows beneath his eyes darker than yesterday. He saw her sitting at the kitchen counter and stopped for half a second, as if he hadn't expected her to be there. Then he gave a slight nod, went straight into his room, and closed the door. That evening, Jet returned to the penthouse at 7 o'clock, an hour earlier than usual. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop. Alara began mixing drinks. No one spoke about last night. No one spoke about his coming home early. But when Alara placed the first cocktail beside his hand, for the first time since she had moved into the penthouse, Jet said, "Thank you." It happened one afternoon. Alara was standing at the kitchen counter, cutting lemons to prepare for the evening shift, when Jet stepped out of the study. Normally, he didn't leave his desk before 8 o'clock. Normally, he didn't walk toward the kitchen counter in the middle of the afternoon. But that day, he stopped about 2 meters away from her, one hand tucked into his trouser pocket, and said without looking at her, "If anyone bothers you, tell me." Alara stopped, the knife resting on the cutting board. She looked at him. "Why?" Jet didn't answer. He stood there for one more second, then turned back to his desk, sat down, opened his laptop, as if the sentence he had just spoken didn't exist. Alara stood beside the counter, looking at his back, and felt something shift in her understanding of this man. That sentence wasn't within the scope of the contract. No one hired a bartender and then said, "If anyone bothers you, tell me." People said that to someone they wanted to protect. But Alara had lived long enough in the real world to know the line between protection and control was very thin, especially with someone like Jet. He controlled everything: the bar, the staff, the transport routes, people. She might simply be one more variable he wanted to keep within sight. Or she might be something else. She didn't know, and she didn't ask a second time. She turned back to cutting lemons, but her hands moved more gently than before, as if his words had lifted part of the weight she carried every day. A weight she hadn't recognized until it grew lighter. Meanwhile, outside the penthouse, on the streets Jet Calder crossed every day, eyes were watching. Salazar wasn't the kind of man who swallowed a loss without looking for a way to return it. After the Danny Ferris matter, after losing the eastern route, after the information about Morrison at Newark Port was exposed, Salazar knew Jet had won this round. But he didn't try to strike head-on. He looked for an opening. Salazar's people had begun watching Jet 2 weeks earlier. Not too close, not too obvious. Just enough to build a pattern. And the pattern showed something unusual. Jet Calder, the man known for never taking the same route twice in a row, the man who changed cars, changed drivers, changed his schedule every day, was repeating a habit. He was coming back to the penthouse earlier, every night, at the same hour. And before that, he had often appeared at a small bar in Lower Manhattan called the Amber. The same corner, the same glass. Salazar's people recorded it. They hadn't acted yet, only recorded. Reed noticed first. Not because he was better than Salazar's men, but because he knew what to look for. He spotted an unfamiliar car parked near the penthouse building 3 evenings in a row. Different license plates, but the same type of car. He checked the security cameras in the lobby. A man in a dark coat and a hat had passed the building twice in 1 hour. That night, after Alara had returned to her room, Reed sat across from Jet in the study. "Someone's watching you." Jet wasn't surprised. In his world, being watched wasn't unusual. Salazar? Not confirmed, but highly likely. How long? At least 2 weeks, maybe longer. Jet nodded. He knew what the standard next step was. Change routes, change schedules. Don't come back to the penthouse at the same hour every night. Don't create a pattern. That was the most basic security rule, one he had lived by for 11 years. Increase security in the lobby and basement, Jet said. Add 1 man on the ground floor at night, and recheck all the cameras. Reed nodded, then waited, because he was waiting for the rest. The part Jet had to say: change the routine. Stop coming back to the penthouse early. Stop creating a predictable route. Jet didn't say it. Reed looked at his boss. You're not changing your schedule? I heard you. Jet. I heard you, Reed. Jet's voice didn't grow louder, but it ended the conversation. Reed stood and walked to the door. He stopped for half a second, wanting to say something more, then didn't. He closed the door behind him. Jet sat alone in the study. He knew Reed was right. He knew he was breaking a rule he had made himself. He knew coming back to the penthouse at the same hour every night was a weakness Salazar could use. But if he changed his schedule, he would come home later, or not come home at all. And if he didn't come home, she would sit alone at the minibar, mixing cocktails for no one, then walk past his door and say goodnight to an empty room. Jet closed his eyes. He knew he was placing something above the survival instinct that had kept him alive for 11 years. He also knew he didn't intend to stop. That night was different from every other night. Alara knew it the moment she stepped into the room. Jet was lying on the bed, but he wasn't lying still the way he usually did. His entire body was rigid, his back arched off the mattress, both hands gripping the sheets so tightly she could hear the fabric strain. His breathing wasn't breathing anymore. It came in broken jerks, inhale and hold, like someone trying not to sink. Then he screamed. Not a loud scream, worse than that. It began as a groan deep in his chest, then rose into a sound that broke halfway through, half scream, half choke, as if something inside the dream were tearing him apart from within, and he didn't have the strength to fight it. Alara didn't wait. She walked to the bed, sat on the edge, and took his hand. This time, she held it tighter than the first time. Not gently, not cautiously. She held him as if she were keeping him from a place she couldn't see. Jet opened his eyes. His body jolted upright by reflex, but this time his hand didn't close around her wrist. His hand closed around hers. Hard, as if she were the only fixed thing in a spinning world. He sat there, eyes open but not seeing yet. A few seconds passed, then his eyes found her, recognized the room, recognized the bed, recognized her. He didn't let go. Alara didn't either. He sat against the headboard, head lowered, eyes on their joined hands. Silence. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. Alara heard his breathing slow, heard his heartbeat through his wrist, falling from frantic back toward normal. She didn't ask what he had dreamed about. She had asked that once already, and he hadn't answered. She didn't ask a second time. But tonight, she didn't need to ask. There was a girl, Jet said. His voice was hoarse and low, each word falling slowly, as if it had to be dragged through a very narrow place in his chest before it could get out. Her name was Marin. Alara sat still, didn't move, didn't breathe too hard. 3 years ago, I was dealing with her brother. He owed my family money, a lot of it, and he ran. We found him. He stopped, swallowed, continued. The confrontation happened in a warehouse outside Newark. He was cornered. My men surrounded him. It should have ended quickly. He stopped longer than before. His hand tightened around hers. Then Marin ran out. His voice broke on the last word. She ran between both sides, put both hands up. She begged us to spare her brother. Silence. When he spoke again, his voice was almost gone. Everything turned chaotic. Someone reacted. She went down. Alara felt his hand tremble. Not the small trembling from the nights before. This tremor came from somewhere deep inside, from a place he had sealed shut for 3 years and now it was cracking open. I ran to her. I held her. His breathing stopped for 1 beat. She looked at me, and her eyes she didn't understand. She didn't understand why. He closed his eyes. She didn't survive. Right there in my arms. And she was 21 years old. Silence. Long. Heavy. Alara heard the clock on the wall, the air conditioner, the city outside the window, and the breathing of the man sitting beside her. The man who had just told her something she was certain he had never told anyone. Now she understood. The four walls closing in when he shut his eyes, the room shrinking, no air left. It wasn't a metaphor. It was the warehouse where Marin had fallen. Every night he went back there. Every night he held her all over again. Every night those uncomprehending eyes looked at him. And every morning he woke and kept living as though nothing had happened, because that was the only thing he knew how to do. Alara didn't say she understood, because she didn't. She didn't know what it felt like to hold someone as life left their body. She didn't say it wasn't his fault, because she hadn't been there. She didn't know whose fault it was, and saying those things now would only be noise, words filling a silence that didn't actually need to be filled. She only held his hand, tighter, and said, softly, just loud enough to hear, "Thank you for telling me." Jet looked at her. In the darkness, she couldn't clearly see his eyes, but she felt it. Something inside him had shifted. Not become lighter. Pain like that didn't become lighter just because it had been spoken aloud. But it was no longer his alone. Now another person knew. Someone was sitting here, holding his hand, not running, not judging, not trying to fix him. Only here. And sometimes, that was the only thing a person needed. Jet said nothing more. He lay down, closed his eyes, his hand still holding hers. And for the first time, he slept without turning his back to Alara. Alara went to visit Mrs. Thorne on a Sunday afternoon. It was the first time she had left the penthouse during the day since moving in. She told Reed she was going to see someone she knew, and Reed nodded, asking nothing more. Mrs. Thorne still lived in the small apartment above the Amber. The bar had a new owner, but she still managed it, still opened it every morning, still closed it every night. When Alara walked in, Mrs. Thorne was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking tea. She looked Alara up and down, not to check her appearance, but with the eyes of someone who had cared for a child long enough to know when that child was hiding something. "You look different," she said. "I'm fine, Mrs. Thorne. I didn't ask if you were fine. I said you look different." Alara sat across from her. Mrs. Thorne poured her a cup of tea. Alara held the cup, turning it slowly in her hands, and tried to speak about her current life as if it were ordinary. She mixed drinks every evening. She had her own room. She was paid on time. Everything was fine. Mrs. Thorne listened, didn't interrupt, didn't nod. When Alara finished, she took a sip of tea. "Who hired you?" "His name is Jet." "What does he do?" Alara was silent one beat too long, and that beat said more than any answer could have. "You're living in a dangerous man's home, Alara." Mrs. Thorne's voice wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. She spoke as though stating an obvious truth they both knew, but only one of them dared say aloud. "You don't know him. I don't need to. I know you. And I know the kind of man who pays a bartender 5 times her salary and gives her a room in his home isn't doing it because he needs cocktails." Alara wanted to argue, wanted to say he wasn't what Mrs. Thorne thought, wanted to say that he had told her about Marin, that his hands had trembled when he spoke, that he had held her hand in the dark and slept for the first time in years. But she didn't say it, because she knew how it would sound if she did. It would sound like a girl trying to convince herself. "He treats you well because he needs you," Mrs. Thorne said. "Right now, you're useful. You help him sleep, or help him forget, or help him with whatever it is you're helping him with. But the day he doesn't need you anymore, what will you be?" Alara looked down at the tea. The surface reflected the ceiling, trembling faintly. Mrs. Thorne's words weren't cruel. She spoke because she was worried. She spoke because she was the only person in the world who cared enough to be honest. But those words didn't stop at Alara's ears. They went straight into the deepest place, the place she had built walls around since childhood, the place that held the memory of every door closing behind her, whenever a foster family decided she was no longer necessary. "The day he doesn't need you anymore, what will you be?" She knew the answer. She would be what she had always been. "The one left behind." "Thank you," Alara said. She finished the tea, hugged Mrs. Thorne, and left. On the way back, she didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She sat on the subway, staring into the black glass, and thought. She thought about every place she had ever stayed, and every place she had ever left. She thought about the penthouse with the empty room bearing no trace of anyone. She thought about the coffee every morning, about the HM behind the door, about the hand holding hers in the dark. Then she thought, All of those things could disappear in one day. He could decide he didn't need her anymore. He could find another way to sleep. He could call Reed, tell Reed to take her away, and she would be standing on the sidewalk again with one small suitcase. She had lived through that enough times to know how much it hurt, and every time, it hurt more than the last. She couldn't survive one more time. Alara returned to the penthouse at 8 o'clock that night. She made Jet's cocktail as usual, said goodnight as usual, went into Jet's room, sat in the armchair, and waited for him to sleep. Everything was normal. Then she returned to her own room, closed the door, and began packing. She hadn't brought much here. One small suitcase, a few sets of clothes, her personal bartending tools. 15 minutes, and it was done. She placed the suitcase beside the door and looked around the room one last time. The largest bed she had ever slept in, the window looking out over Manhattan, the most beautiful room she had ever stayed in, and she was leaving. At midnight, she pulled the suitcase into the hallway, past Jet's room. The door was ajar. Inside, his breathing was steady. He was asleep. She stopped. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then she kept walking. Down the elevator, into the lobby, called a taxi. She didn't leave a letter, didn't send a message, didn't explain, because explaining meant giving him the chance to keep her. And if he asked her to stay, she would stay. And if she stayed, she would stay one more day, then 1 week, then 1 month, until she forgot that she could be left at any moment. She stepped into the taxi, gave Mrs. Thorne's address. The taxi drove away. On the top floor of the Tribeca building, Jet stood at his bedroom window. He had been awake since she pulled the suitcase through the hallway. The sound of the wheels rolling over the wooden floor was soft enough that most people wouldn't have heard it. But Jet wasn't most people. He looked down. In front of the lobby, a yellow taxi was waiting. Alara stepped out of the building, suitcase behind her. She didn't look up. She opened the taxi door, pushed the suitcase in, and climbed after it. The door closed. The taxi pulled away. Jet stood at the window, watching it grow smaller, turn left at the end of the street, and disappear. He didn't call her, didn't call Reed, didn't run down to the lobby. He stood there, looking at the empty street, then lifted his phone. Called Reed. Miss Quinn just left. Silence. Do you want me to? She left on her own. No one drove her out. Then he hung up and stood at the window for a very long time, looking at a street where no one was there anymore. Alara slept on the sofa in Mrs. Thorne's living room the first night. Mrs. Thorne didn't ask anything. She only spread out a sheet, set down a pillow, and let her lie down. The next morning, she said, "You can stay as long as you want." Alara nodded. She didn't explain why she had left the penthouse. She didn't need to. Mrs. Thorne had seen her walk in at 1 o'clock in the morning with a small suitcase, and she had understood. She had said what needed to be said that afternoon, and Alara had listened. On the second day, Alara began looking for work. She walked through Lower Manhattan, stopping at bar after bar, restaurant after restaurant, asking if they needed a bartender. She found a place in Hell's Kitchen, a small bar, paying less than any wage she had ever accepted, but they needed someone to start right away. She took the job that afternoon. Life returned to what it had been before she stepped into that VIP room that night. Wake up in the morning, make her own coffee, go to work, come home, sleep, repeat. Normal. She was fine. She had lived like this for 27 years. She knew how to live alone. She knew how to start over from nothing. She had done it so many times that it had almost become reflex. But on the morning of the third day, as Alara stood in Mrs. Thorne's kitchen making coffee with the old pot Mrs. Thorne had used for 10 years, she realized her hand was adding cinnamon. She didn't drink cinnamon. She had never added cinnamon to coffee before coming to the penthouse. Her hand stopped. She looked at the spoonful of cinnamon in her hand, and realized that what she missed wasn't the vast penthouse or the largest bed she had ever slept in. She missed the smell of morning coffee, no one admitted to making. She missed the sound of footsteps in the hallway late at night, heavy and even, letting her know he had come home. She poured the coffee out, made it again, no cinnamon, then went to work. She didn't cry. She didn't fall apart. She didn't lie on the sofa all day. She went to work, mixed drinks, smiled at customers, cleaned the bar, came home, because that was what she knew how to do. Endure and continue. But every night, When she lay on the sofa in Mrs. Thorne's living room before falling asleep, she wondered whether he was sleeping. Across the city, in the penthouse on the top floor in Tribeca, the answer was no. Jet didn't sleep. Not the first night. Not the second. Not the third. He lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and the room felt larger than ever. The armchair in the corner was empty. There were no light footsteps on the floor at 10 o'clock. No good night outside the door. No faint scent of herbs in the air. Only silence. And four walls. Reed noticed on the third day. Not because Jet said anything. Jet said nothing at all. But Reed had walked beside this man for 11 years, and he knew how to read what Jet didn't say. On the morning of the third day, Jet arrived at a meeting 15 minutes late. Jet Calder had never been late. Not once in 11 years. During the meeting, he asked for a number to be repeated. A number he normally would have memorized the first time he heard it. That afternoon, he sat in the study at the penthouse with his laptop open, but Reed looked over his shoulder and saw him staring at a blank screen for 20 minutes. The shadows beneath his eyes were darker, his jaw was tighter, and he drank coffee constantly, one cup after another, as if caffeine could replace what had disappeared from the penthouse 3 nights earlier. On the evening of the third day, Reed sat across from Jet in the study, not to report on business. He only sat there, waiting. Jet worked, or pretended to work. "Are you going to find her?" Reed asked. Jet didn't look up. "No." "Why?" No answer. Reed sat quietly for a while longer. Then he asked, his voice lower now, not the voice of a subordinate speaking to his boss, but the voice of someone who had walked beside another person for 11 years. "Are you punishing yourself? Or are you punishing her?" Jet looked up. His eyes were cold, but not cold toward Reed, cold toward himself. He didn't answer. Reed stood. "I'll be here if you need me." Then he walked out and closed the door softly behind him. Jet sat alone, the penthouse silent around him, wide, empty, and without a good night outside his door. Salazar's men had been watching Jet long before Ilara left the penthouse. They knew he often went to the Amber, knew he had changed his habit and started coming home earlier, knew there was a new variable in Jet Calder's life that they hadn't yet identified. When Ilara left the penthouse at midnight with her small suitcase, Salazar's men recorded it. They followed the taxi to Mrs. Thorne's home. They followed her to the new bar in Hell's Kitchen. They recorded her shifts, her route, the hour she came home. It took them 3 days to confirm it. This girl was no longer under Jet's protection. No bodyguard. No car. No surveillance camera. She walked home alone every night through the empty streets of Hell's Kitchen. And that was all they needed. Ilara left the bar at 11 o'clock at night, on the 5th day after she had left the penthouse. She walked 2 blocks toward Mrs. Thorne's home, earbuds in, her bag on her shoulder. She didn't see the car parked half a block away. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her because the music in her ears was too loud. She only knew something was happening when a hand grabbed her arm from behind and a voice told her to be quiet. The message came to Jet's phone at 11:23. He was sitting in the study at the penthouse, not sleeping, because he hadn't been able to sleep since she left. The phone vibrated. Unknown number. A photograph. Ilara, sitting on a chair, her hands tied behind her back, her mouth sealed with tape. Her eyes were open, looking straight into the camera, frightened, but not crying. Beneath the photo was one line of text. "Control of the Southern Territory. All of it. You have 12 hours. Jet looked at the photograph. His finger on the screen didn't move, his eyes fixed on Ilara's eyes in the picture, and he looked for a very long time, until Reed stepped into the room, because he had heard the phone vibrate from the hallway, and knew a phone vibrating at 11 o'clock at night was never good news. "Jet?" Jet turned the screen toward Reed. Reed looked, his face hardened. "Salazar? Who else?" Reed looked at the line beneath it. "They want to trade, the Southern Territory." The Southern Territory was where the Calder family controlled the 3 largest transport routes into the city, accounting for nearly 40% of the empire's revenue. Losing that territory wouldn't just mean losing money. It would mean losing standing, losing position, losing control of the balance of power Jet had spent 11 years building. Salazar knew that. That was why he had demanded it. The study went silent. Reed stood beside the desk, waiting. He knew Jet was thinking. He also knew this kind of silence. This wasn't the silence of a man weighing his options. This was the silence of a man pressing something down deep enough that it wouldn't erupt before he was ready. Jet placed the phone on the desk, gently, like setting down a bomb he didn't want to trigger. Call Marcus. Call Webb. Call every territory chief. I want them here in 30 minutes. Reed didn't move. What are you going to do? No trade. Jet stood. I'm going to bring her back. Reed looked at him. 11 years. 11 years Reed had walked beside Jet Calder. And not once, never once, had he seen Jet personally walk into enemy territory for one person. Never. Because in this world, going there meant admitting it. Admitting that person mattered. Admitting that Jet Calder, the man with no weakness, had one. And admitting that in front of an enemy wasn't only losing standing, it was inviting them to strike the most painful place every time they wanted to. Jet, Reed said, his voice careful. If you go there, they'll know she matters. You'll lose position. Not just today, forever. Every time someone wants to force your hand, they'll know where to aim. Jet looked at Reed. Not cold, not angry, only with the eyes of a man who had already decided and was waiting for the world to catch up. I know. 2 words. Only 2 words. But they held everything. He knew what he was trading away. He knew the cost. He knew that after tonight, every rule of the game would change. And he still chose to go. Reed looked at his boss for 1 more second. Then he pulled out his phone and began making calls. While Reed called, Jet stood by the window, looking down at the city. The same window where, 5 nights earlier, he had stood and watched Alara step into a taxi and disappear. That time, he had let her go. This time, he wouldn't let anyone keep her. Jet didn't go to Salazar. He called one of Salazar's men. Not Salazar directly, but Coronel, the man who handled the finances for the entire opposing faction in the West. Coronel answered the phone at midnight, and before his voice could finish the greeting, Jet had already begun. The Cayman account Salazar uses to launder money through the real estate company in Delaware. The account number ends in 724. I have the statements from the last 3 years. Silence. The transport route through the Baltimore port that you opened 6 months ago. I know the ship names. I know who signed the clearance papers. I know which customs officers you bought. I also know the FBI is watching that route, and they haven't acted only because they don't have enough evidence yet. Jet stopped for 1 second, just long enough for Coronel to understand that what he had just said wasn't an empty threat. So I can send those statements with the full list to the FBI before tomorrow morning. Or you can return my girl, and I'll forget tonight ever happened. Coronel didn't answer for 15 seconds. Jet counted every one. Then Coronel spoke, his voice careful. This isn't my decision. I know. That's why I'm giving you 15 minutes to call the person who can make it. And you should tell Salazar I'm driving to you now. If she isn't ready to leave when I get there, I'll send the email before I step out of the car. Jet hung up. Reed sat beside him, driving. He didn't ask anything. He knew Jet had prepared for this scenario long ago. The information on Salazar, on the accounts, on the Baltimore route, Jet had gathered years earlier. He had never used it because it was worth more as a card kept in reserve. Tonight, he played that card. For a girl who mixed cocktails, Reed drove to a warehouse district on the outskirts of Newark. 2 black cars were parked in front of the gate. Jet told Reed to stop 50 meters away. Stay in the car, Jet said. Reed looked at him. Jet. Stay in the car. Jet opened the door and stepped out. He walked alone toward the warehouse gate. Back straight. Steps even. Face expressionless. 2 men standing at the gate watched him approach. One lifted a phone, said something brief, then opened the gate. Jet walked in. Inside, 3 men stood in the middle of the empty warehouse. 1 chair. Alara sat on it, her hands already untied, the tape over her mouth already removed. She looked up when she heard footsteps. Her eyes found Jet, and she saw something she hadn't expected. His face was cold, completely cold, like stone. No worry, no relief, not one thread of emotion slipping through. He walked to the center of the warehouse, stopped, and looked at the man leading the group. Can she leave now? Jet's voice was flat as a tabletop. The leader nodded. Not happily, but Coronel had called, Salazar had agreed, and no one in that warehouse wanted to be the one to test whether Jet Calder would really send that email to the FBI. Jet looked toward Alara. His eyes swept over her quickly and precisely. Hands, legs, face, Her wrists were bruised where she had been tied. Her left cheekbone was lightly scratched, probably from rubbing against the chair when she struggled. Other than that, there were no serious injuries. He didn't hug her, didn't run to her, didn't ask if she was all right. He stood 3 meters away from her, his face cold, and said, "Go." One word. Elara stood. Her legs trembled from sitting too long on the hard chair. She walked toward Jet. He turned his back and walked to the door, and she followed. No one said anything. No one looked back. They walked out of the warehouse, through the gate, and toward the car. Reed had already opened the rear door. Jet let Elara get in first, then climbed in after her. The car door closed. Reed started driving. And in the moment the car door separated them from the world outside, in the moment no one could see them anymore. No enemy, no subordinate, no one. Everything Jet had been holding together collapsed. His hand found hers. He took it, hard. So hard Elara almost pulled away because it hurt. But she didn't. She looked down at their joined hands in the darkness of the back seat. His hand held hers as if she would vanish if he let go, and his hand was shaking. She looked at him. His face was still turned forward, his jaw still clenched tight, his eyes still looking straight ahead, but the muscle in his jaw twitched faintly under the skin, and his hand was shaking. Elara said nothing. She turned back to face the front, and held his hand back, just as tightly. All the way back to Manhattan, no one said a single word. Reed drove through the Holland Tunnel, through Tribeca, and back to the building. 35 minutes. Jet didn't let go of her hand, not for 1 second. When they reached the penthouse, Reed stopped the car at the lobby, opened the door for both of them, then said to Jet, "I'll be down here. Call if you need anything." Jet nodded. He and Elara stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. In the small space of the elevator, Jet was still holding her hand. He hadn't let go since they were in the car. Elara looked down at their hands, then up at his face. Under the white elevator lights, she could see more clearly. His eyes were shadowed. His jaw was still tight. But his eyes, for the first time since she had met him, weren't cold. They were only tired. So tired she wanted to put her hand on his face and tell him to close his eyes. The elevator doors opened. They stepped into the penthouse. Jet let go of her hand for the first time in 40 minutes, went straight into the bathroom, and came back with a small first aid kit. He pulled out a chair and set it in front of Elara. "Sit." She sat. He sat across from her, opened the kit, took out cotton, antiseptic, and bandage tape. He held her hand and turned her wrist over. The bruise where she had been tied had darkened to deep purple. He soaked the cotton with antiseptic, then gently cleaned the scratch on her cheekbone. His hand was shaking. Not much, but enough for the cotton to tremble faintly when it touched her skin. Elara looked at his hand. "Are you scared?" Jet didn't look up. He kept cleaning the scratch. "Your hand is shaking," she said. He stopped. The cotton still touched her cheek. Silence stretched. Then Jet spoke, his voice low and breaking in the middle, like a sentence he had to force out of his chest. "Last time I couldn't save her. This time I almost wasn't in time." He didn't say the name. He didn't need to. Elara knew who he meant. She had heard that story in the dark, holding his hand, on the night he told her about the young woman who had fallen in the middle of chaos and never stood up again. She looked at him. He was still looking down at her hand, at the bruise on her wrist, and she understood that he wasn't only seeing her wound. He was seeing another wound, older, deeper, on the wrist of a girl he hadn't been able to save. Elara placed her hand over his trembling one, lightly, enough to stop him, enough to make him look up. "She's gone because of something you couldn't control," Elara said. Her voice was soft, slow, each word chosen carefully. "I'm still here because of something you chose. That's enough." Jet looked at her. His eyes were red, not from crying, just the redness of a man who had held himself together too long and had reached the point where the body would no longer allow him to hold any more. He said nothing, but his hand stopped shaking. He placed the bandage over the scratch on her cheek so gently she almost couldn't feel it. Then he stood, put away the first aid kit, and went into his room. Said nothing more. That night, Elara sat in the familiar armchair in Jet's room. He lay down, and this time, he didn't turn his back. He lay on his side, facing her, and closed his eyes. He fell asleep within 5 minutes. Deep, quiet, no nightmare. Elara sat in the chair, watching him sleep, and for the first time allowed herself to think that maybe, Maybe. She would stay longer than she had thought. A few days passed. Everything returned to the old rhythm, but it had changed in small ways. Only the two of them noticed. Jet no longer pretended not to look at her when she set the glass beside his hand. Sometimes he looked up, gave a faint nod, then returned to work. Sometimes she caught him watching her from his desk while she mixed drinks, and he quickly looked away when she turned back. She said nothing. She only smiled and kept cutting lemons. Then came the 4th morning after the rescue. There was nothing special about that morning. Sunlight came through the windows. Alara stood at the kitchen counter making coffee. Jet sat at the table, reading something on his phone. Completely normal. Alara poured coffee into a cup. Then she said, softly, as though she were talking about the weather, "I passed through a lot of different families growing up." Jet didn't look up, but his finger stopped scrolling on the phone. "No place kept me for long. Every time I thought I might get to stay, I had to leave again. The last time," the foster mother said, "You're a very good girl, but there isn't enough room in the house." She set the coffee in front of him. "After that, I never tried to be good anymore." Jet looked up, looked at her. She didn't look back. She was washing the coffee pot, her back to him, as if she had just said something ordinary and life was still going on. Then she added, still facing away, still washing the pot, "You're not the only one who thinks he doesn't deserve things." The sound of running water, the light tap of the pot against the sink, the most ordinary sounds in the world. Jet sat at the table, the coffee in front of him, looking at her back. He didn't say thank you. Didn't say I understand. Didn't say any of the things people usually said when someone had opened a wound and shown it to them. He only picked up the coffee, took a sip, and when Alara turned back, she saw that his hand wasn't shaking anymore. Jet didn't change overnight. There was no magical moment that turned a man carrying 3 years of nightmares into someone whole just because someone held his hand in the dark. The nightmares still came. The first week after the rescue, he woke at 3 o'clock in the morning, soaked in sweat, breathing hard. But when he opened his eyes, Alara was there. In the armchair, her eyes open, looking at him, not afraid, not pitying him, just there. "I'm here," she said. He closed his eyes again and went back to sleep. The second week, the nightmares came 3 times instead of every night. The third week, twice. The fourth week, once. Marin was still in his dreams. Those eyes that didn't understand why didn't disappear. Maybe they never would completely. But Jet began to understand that carrying that memory didn't mean he had to be imprisoned by it every night. He could remember Marin and still sleep. He could hurt and still live. Those two things didn't cancel each other out. Reed noticed the change first in the 2nd month, during a meeting about territorial expansion. When one route chief suggested forcing a small shop owner to give up his space, Jet said, "Find another location. Don't touch civilians." The whole room went silent, not because the sentence was wrong, but because Jet Calder had never said that sentence before. Reed looked at his boss. He hadn't gone soft. His voice was still cold. His orders were still final, but a new boundary had been drawn, and that boundary hadn't existed 6 months earlier. Jet didn't become a good man. He was still Jet Calder, still controlling, still dangerous, still the man the whole New York underworld didn't dare turn its back on, but he was choosing a different way to be hard. And Reed, who had walked beside him for 11 years, knew what had changed. Not the power, the reason he used it. 3 months after the rescue, Alara told Jet she wanted to open her own bar. He looked at her. "Fine, I'll invest the capital." "No, Alara." I said no. He offered a second time. She refused a second time. He offered a third time, this time through Reed, with a financial analysis that Alara suspected Reed had added himself to persuade her. She looked at the analysis, looked at Jet, looked at Reed. "I'll take the capital, but this is a loan, not a gift. I'll pay back every cent. There'll be a contract, interest, and a repayment schedule." Jet frowned. "Why?" "Because I need to know this bar is mine." He looked at her longer than usual, then nodded. The new bar was in the West Village, smaller than the Amber, just large enough for 15 seats and 1 counter. Alara chose the name herself, designed the menu herself, hired the staff herself. Jet didn't interfere. On opening day, he didn't come. He sent flowers, no name attached. Alara looked at the bouquet, shook her head, smiled, and placed it on the counter. Mrs. Thorne came on opening day. She stood at the door, looked around the small bar. looked at the girl she had given her first job 7 years earlier, now standing behind a bar of her own. "It's a beautiful place," she said. "Thank you. Are you happy?" Alara thought for a moment. "I'm building something for myself. For the first time." Mrs. Thorne nodded, didn't ask more, because that answer was enough. Late that night, the bar had closed. Alara was wiping the counter, getting ready to lock the door, when she heard familiar footsteps outside. The door opened. Jet stepped in. He looked around the small bar, then walked straight to the innermost corner, sat down, his back to the wall, his eyes facing the door. Habit. Alara didn't ask what he wanted to drink. She turned back to the counter, took out the ingredients, and mixed. Lavender, chamomile, honey, a little orange peel, the old recipe, the original version. She placed the glass in front of him. Jet lifted it, took a sip, closed his eyes, his shoulders lowered, and on the face of the man the whole New York underworld didn't dare turn its back on. There appeared something Alara had only ever seen when he slept. Peace. Alara stood behind the counter, the wiping cloth still in her hand, looking at him, and smiled. If this story touched you, please press like and share it so more people can hear it. How did this story make you feel? Please comment below and share what's deep in your heart. We always want to listen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next stories every day. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every single day. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.